Hello again and welcome to video 2 of 4 in this series. In this video and the next 2 videos I will explore examples of student written essays which have attained a certain mark scheme, a certain mark within the scheme, so that you can see the level of writing and how it corresponds, and hopefully so you can then emulate some of the higher level answers in your own response. So this one I'm beginning with is based on this question. Men may seem to be more powerful than women, but the reality is very different. Now, this was an actual exam question, and these are actual pupils that have responded to it. Each of the 3 essays will be answering the same question, and I've chosen to do that deliberately so that you can see how the answers improve throughout the mark scheme. So this essay is a level 4 response. Now, if we examine our mark scheme from the previous video and look at level 4, we can see that the key words in level 4 is competent. So this student is showing a competent understanding of context. They have competently compared it. They're competently using their knowledge of a text to answer the question, and their answers are informed by some reference to different interpretations. Now, my aim is to go through the essay and to point out where they have done these things and why it is the level that it is. Now, this is a top of level 4 response. It got a mark of 19 out of 30. Very roughly speaking, because this obviously depends, we can't take this in isolation. The grade would very obviously depend on how you do in Hamlet and indeed how you've done in exam 2 and your coursework. But if we were to take it in isolation, this would equate a C grade, roughly, based on 2024 boundaries. It is worth noting that grade boundaries can change depending on the performance of the cohort. With that caveat in mind, let's begin to look at the paper and see why it got this mark. Now, what the examiner has said about this is that it begins soundly and actually gathers in strength. They've said that the answer is ultimately substantial competence, and they have said that the student's response is wide-ranging, but it doesn't always focus on the requirements of the dominant assessment objectives. And what they mean by that, and hopefully I will highlight when we read through the paper, they mean AO3 and AO4. Now, their contextual comments, as per the examiner, the comment made on that is that they're rather generalised at times. And what they mean by that is the candidate has not specified the context and integrated it into their answer particularly well. When the examiner talks about AO5, they have said there's substantial reliance on both the roles of other readers in the response and on a rather narrative approach. So again, I'll hopefully highlight where that has happened. Overall, though, the examiner says the answer shows highly competent understanding of the significance and influence of context within the text. So let's dive in. Now, this person has provided an introduction. Gender and power are 2 themes that often reoccur in Ibsen's plays and Rossetti's poetry, while both authors highlighting the role and status of women. The debate to which one is more powerful and the portrayal will be explored in this essay. So we can see the statement, men may seem to be more powerful than women, but reality is very different. They have taken the focus of that statement, which is gender within the both texts, and they have made a comparative idea that indeed both texts do present gender. It could be developed more. Gender and power are 2 themes. They could point out here how it's portrayed and how it differs to improve that AO4 score. Now, they also say both authors highlight the role and status of women. This is borderline touching on AO3, but it is very vague. However, they have introduced the topic and they've made a brief comparison, which begins us off on a good note. It's always good to start your writing with an introduction that references the focus of the question. Moving on to their first point then. In a doll's house, Nora is confined by her husband Torvald, who treats her like a child through the use of pet names such as Skylark. This is a piece of relevant AO1, but again, if we focus on why this is level 4 and not level 5, they are correct. He does treat her like a child, but we could ask why. Why is this relevant? Why are the pet names such as Skylark, how does that infantilise her? They do, as we read on, try to address the why, but this is one of the points the examiner drew as generalised. In Norway, in the time that this play was received, women's roles were centred around being a housewife and serving their husbands and children, showing that Nora is following her expected roles. That is correct, but as per the examiner, it's a piece of very generalised AO3, and they've not specifically linked it to their point. Continuing onwards, critics from the L-code feminist theory said, it is women's confinement in private spheres which correlate with women's subordinate status. This having the view that through the suppression by men, women are seen as less equal. That is a relevant critical quote. It is competently related to what they have said before. The reason it's not level 5 though is because none of these things are tied together. The candidate then goes on to discuss Rossetti's poetry. Yet, in some of Rossetti's work, the female speaker pushes back against being confined in her humorous but forceful poem, No Thank You John, which is written to one of her suitors. She is highlighting her right to say no. So we have elements of comparison here. They are saying that unlike Ibsen, Rossetti portrays women in this fashion. A right that women didn't often have the voice to enforce. Although Gaynell Gate proposed that to reject a marriage proposal seemed to counter Victorian mentality. The speaker's rejection and determination could be suggesting that she isn't going to conform to the Victorian mentality just because a man or social convention demands it. Now, this, to contrast the previous AO5 point, is a much better integrated point. They've used the critical idea and they've tied it in with their knowledge of the poem. Moving on to the next page. Both writers explore gender through societal expectations, but in different ways. So again, here we have a valid comparison point, but the reason it's competent and not good is because they haven't explored which ways. The initial lines of Rossetti's From the Antique uncompromisingly comment on the role and status of women. The speaker goes on to suggest that it would be easier if women were extinct and that they would suffer less. So here we have AO1, a clear understanding of the poem. Again, it may be better supported by quotations, but it's obvious that the candidate knows what they're talking about. Dolores Rosenblum said, when a woman has to make herself into or pretend to be an alluring object, then the very face itself becomes a mask. This view could be linked to Nora as well, in the sense that a facade covers the truth of marriage. So here we have the beginnings of a good point. We have a comment about Rossetti, a critical theory that isn't particularly tied to that, but is then better tied to their comparative point that they've made about Nora in Ibsen. They do go on to explore this more though. The poem shows the alienation and oppression felt by women of the Victorian period, which was a period with much debate over women's role and the thinking about women's access to education, employment and voting. So here we have a piece of AO3 which is tied into this previous idea about the presentation of women in From the Antique. Ibsen's Nora also doesn't completely conform to the expectations of society when she borrows money behind Torvald's back, which was illegal to not have your husband's consent. So relevant details from Ibsen. Also noteworthy is the fact that she described it as her pride and was proud to feel like a man. This wouldn't have been expected of Nora, considering it was portrayed that she wouldn't understand by Mrs. Linda. So here we have some AO1 points that are related to the context that they've provided. Again, I would say the main criticism of this is that they could better integrate and explore what the writer is showing through these presentations. Here we then have, to finish his comparison off, critic Millett in 1971 said Nora confronted every convention and chivalrous masculine prejudice that laid her. Both writers, through the use of their speakers or characters, confronted the expected conventions. And here we have a higher level AO4 level 4 response. It is more developed and more competent than how they begin at the beginning of the paragraph. Their next point focuses on, through the institution of marriage and through the complexities of relationship, gender and power were explored. In Rossetti's ballad-like poem, Maud Clare intrudes the wedding of her ex-lover Thomas and Nell to return items. Nell and Maud are shown as opposites, with Nell being depicted as a village maid, but Maud as a queen. Thomas stays very quiet and hides his face, which could be a critique of masculine dominance. And here we have a competent piece of AO1 where they've shown clear understanding of the content of the poem and actually linked it to Rossetti's possible intent. This wouldn't have been expected of women, as she was supposed to be subordinate. And again, a more generalised piece of AO3 there. Andrew Stewart noted its illustrations in combination with the text as the layout challenged these ideas. However, the explicit and implicit meanings lessen the challenge and create a more ambiguous position. AO5, which they then explore. Perhaps the ambiguous position is where not all women were able to achieve the goals society had set. Perhaps the ambiguous position is where not all women were able to achieve the goals that society had set out for them. The explicit and implicit meanings could link to Rossetti's views. Now, this section is an attempt at linking their AO1, AO5 and AO3. The explicit and implicit meanings could link to Rossetti's views, which were sometimes conflicting. For example, she often used biblical references of women being subordinate as a reason to maintain this norm, but then argued for female representation in Parliament. Now, their AO3 there does link to their previous point about the ambiguity of Victorian women. It is worth noting, though, that Rossetti's views on female suffrage, she was actually against it. That is slightly different to female representation in Parliament. This again fits why it's a level 4. The candidate is showing competent understanding, but it isn't explored in more depth. To continue. In the marriage of Torvald and Nora, it's often hard to tell if Nora is complicit and whether or not she encourages his treatment of her. The idea of her giving a performance can be seen in the dance of a tarantella, which is associated with being bitten by a spider and having to dance out the poison linked to hysteria. When she is practicing, she begs for Torvald's help, making her seem manipulative. Though an important message radiates for A Doll's House, which was proposed by August Strindberg, marriage was revealed as being far from a divine visitation. People stopped believing it was an automatic provider of bliss. This could be due to the facade that Nora removes and shows the issues within a marriage. So here, again, this is why we go to the top of level 4. What they have done here is a relevant comparison to the Maud Clare idea. They've explored the ideas of Nora competently and linked it in to their AO5 point. Although Torvald still maintains the power, as he forbids her to eat macaroons and expects her to continue her patriarchal ideal. In Norway at the time, the upper class was getting bigger, which meant societal expectations were created. The idea of bourgeoisie respectability, where families weren't supposed to be in debt, kept good morals, and continued to conform with expected roles. Ironic, considering she is in debt to Krogstad and the importance that Torvald places upon the perception of others. Both writers show the flaws within marriage and the overarching idea that marriage was a place of guaranteed bliss. So here, again, the examiner would argue that the AO3 is slightly generalised, but they have done a better job of integrating it with their point about the text. It continues. The theme of power is less prominent through Rossetti's work, though it is evident in the poem Winter My Secret, where the speaker torments the reader about her secret, though explicitly makes clear she won't tell everyone that taps. Through the playfulness, there is a sense of manipulation of power, especially when she suggests there may be no secret at all. Again, a relevant piece of AO1 there. It could be improved by explaining how and what kind of power she is manipulating. We compare. Ibsen shows Nora's power in a different way by her choosing to leave. Audiences were shocked by Nora proclaiming it was her duty to leave, as this completely went against the mentality of the audience watching. Though some critics appreciated her leaving, it was this young woman's duty, her inescapable duty, to leave this man, this husband, who didn't understand her as a human being. So here we do have a comparison to the idea in Rossetti. I am sounding repetitive, but it again could be developed in more detail. We have the idea of how this was received at the time, which feeds into our AO5 and our AO3. A pivotal moment in women's history as debates began to happen around the rights of women. Another way power is explored is through the importance placed upon money. Nora and Torvald are overjoyed at the prospect that Torvald may get a pay increase. This could link to Norway's economy at the time, where an economic boom had occurred which brought prosperity, although it did also bring an over-awareness and over-obsession with money, which could be shown in the stress caused by debt or how Nora craves to spend the money. Both writers show the negotiation of power, highlighting the issues that could potentially leave them powerless. So again, we have more attempts at comparison, which could be linked more specifically to the AO1 points that they made about the text. It finishes with a conclusion and general summary. Overall, From the Antique shows the alienation and desire to be dead instead of following ideologies and identities imposed upon them. Whereas No Thank You John, Winter My Secret and Maud Clare show a conflict between conforming to ideas of men being more powerful, but then also implicitly challenging that. From the Antique was never published in Rossetti's lifetime, probably due to the foreshadowed criticism. They probably mean aforementioned. This links to Ibsen, who was asked to write another ending. Both writers' work was influential in the 19th century and beyond, in kickstarting the rise in feminism and importance of the role of women being more, both portraying a realistic view and a story that can still be relatable today. Hattie Morahan depicted Ibsen's work as milieus that showed universal anxiety. So the end of their essay gives an overall summary and tries to encapsulate what both writers were doing. It is competent and it shows understanding, and I will repeat my point from the beginning. What it needs to be better is more detail and more nuance.